Go.
Okay, welcome everybody. This is the Moon Village Association Cultural Considerations Working Group, and we're happy to welcome you to our today's webinar, the Deep Space Effect 3, Deep Space, Awe or Fright. And we have two great presenters today, Deanna Weibel and Christopher Kikinos, and I will introduce them just a minute later. However, this is our third webinar on the deep space effect. The previous one, well, it's not going. The previous one was on culture and the human space program, and that happened in March this year. And earlier than that, we had the first one on this topic, which was the deep space effect and its influence on human society. Okay, our speakers today are Deanna Weibel. She's a professor of anthropology at the Grand Valley State University, and she has a joint appointment at Brooks College Religious Studies program. She is an anthropologist with over 25 years of experience in ethnographic research and university teaching. She has expertise in the anthology of religion and religious studies, conducting innovative research into the religious aspects of space exploration, including the research into a phenomenon known as the ultra-view effect. You might want to look at the Space Review. She's had two articles which are related to today's webinar directly. Today actually appeared one, which is very advantageous for us. Cultural Considerations in Space Exploration, Insights for NASA's Artemis II mission. And before, this is a very interesting article called Black Ugliness and the Covering of the Blue, William Shatner's Suborbital Flight to Death. And her topic of today is called An Outrageous View of the Heavens, the Ultraview Effect as a Cognitive and Cultural Response to the Panorama of Deep Space. Our other speaker is Christopher Kikinos. We know him. He was part of our Fly Me to the Moon project, and he's been a presenter here on the Moon Village before. And he's an associate professor in the Master of Fine Arts program at the University of Arizona. He's author or co-author of 7
Io non sto parlando, perciò non devi fare silenzio. Ho messo anche...
What? Can you turn off your microphone, Gilo? Okay, he's the author or co-author of several books, The Fallen Sky, an Infinite History of the Shooting Stars, and he got the National Space Foundation grant, and he participated in scientific research to Antarctica, which his back screen shows us. He is co-editor of the anthology Beyond Earth's Edge, The Poetry of Spaceflight. And we had a webinar on this book with his co-author on January 12th, 2021. And these webinars are all archived on the lunarology.space website. And his new book is soon to come out. It's called Still is Bright, A Backyard Journey Through the Natural and Human History of the Moon, which will be published next year. So his topic today is Awe is Not Enough, contextualizing astronomical views through the history and of the sublime and looking towards scientific studies of the overview effects. Well, our topic today is deep space, awe or fright. So it's going to be a contrast between, oh my God, it's full of stars, which is a famous quote from Stanley Kubrick's and Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Is very famous, and is also was mentioned by Michael Collins and his observation to the journey of the Gemini 10 mission. My God, the stars are everywhere. So this awe of looking into deep space, and that's contrast with what happened with William Shatner. And here's a conversation he had just on his return to Earth with Jeff Bezos. And Bezos says, and you're just in blackness. Shatner, and you're in death. Yeah, the moment you. Bezos looking to the ground, this is life. Shatner, this is life and that's death. And it's an instant you go, whoa, that's death. That's what I saw. So these are two big contrasts to the experience of the deep space effect or the ultra effect. So let's have our two speakers let us know more about this. Okay, thank you. Dana?
All right, I'll start.
Okay.
Let me go ahead and share screen. And then it's going to take just a second. All right. Everybody can see everything at this point?
Yes.
All right. So, so the title of my presentation, An Outrageous View of the Heavens, that comes from one of the astronauts that I interviewed, referred to what you could see from space. The subtitle, The Ultra View Effect is a Cognitive and Cultural Response to the Panorama of Deep Space, is something I've been interested for a while. And I have a website too. It's just my name, dinaweibel.space, and you can find me there. So let's get started. Oh, we're doing this thing. There we go. One of the things that I need to talk about coming into this is my own background is as an anthropologist of religion. I'm not somebody with science and technology studies background. I am an anthropologist of religion who has always been interested in sacred places and the ways that people interact with and visit sacred places, whether as pilgrims or tourists, and how we define those terms is not always really obvious. When I met my husband, who is a former chief historian at the Johnson Space Center, Glenn E. Swanson, I was very excited because I've always been really interested in space and space exploration. And as I got sort of enculturated into the larger space culture, which is multi-sided and kind of amorphous, I began to notice a lot of interesting parallels. So some of the first things I wrote about were space exploration as a form of pilgrimage and how that would work. There are a lot of parallels that I noticed. For one thing, outer space is often described as sacred space. And the language that we use in both talking about religion and talking about outer space in English, but also a lot of other languages, is very similar. So we'll talk about things being unearthly, otherworldly, celestial, ethereal. All of those things usually can refer to both outer space and religious sort of concepts, because they both are connecting us to things that are not mundane and that are also not understood well. So we have this kind of shared space of the unknown and the awesome. And I noticed when people went to space, there were a lot of commonalities. I won't go into too much detail, just providing a little context. The picture here is a shrine called Chimayo in New Mexico, and people will go there to be healed. There's dirt that's believed to have healing powers. And one of the things you do is you leave photographs of your loved ones to show that you've been to the shrine, that you want your loved ones prayed for, that you want God to think of your loved ones. And Charlie Duke is famous for leaving a photograph of his family on the surface of the moon, which was a really interesting parallel. Another thing that I've noticed is people, at least in neo-pagan and Wiccan and New Age forms of pilgrimage, will bring objects to sacred places and allow those objects in their minds or spiritually, I can't say whether a real thing is taking place or not, to be transformed by being in a specific location. And I've noticed that in space travel, what astronauts bring in their personal preference kits, objects that have been in space, especially that have been taken up by humans, acquire a really interesting resale value. This was a bit, I believe, of a parachute that had been in space that somebody was selling suspended in liquid on eBay at the end of a pen. And I think this was something like $250 just because it had been in space. And these things we leave behind, we call ex votos in pilgrimage, this transformation. People treat outer space when they travel to it frequently as sacred space, especially the moon. I also have noticed parallels between pilgrimage and panoramas. One of my favorite anthropologists, Jackie Feldman, is a tour guide as well as an anthropologist. He's at Ben Gurion University, and he leads tours in Jerusalem, and he talks, and I'm going to be reading a lot of quotes in here, but I'll try to make them interesting. He says in one of his articles, for Protestant pilgrims, Holy Land landscape is a projection of sacred text onto the contours of the land. He continues, the panoramic view is an expression of power. And he talks about pilgrims seeing this view from a distance, especially Protestant pilgrims, going to the Mount of Olives, climbing up, seeing Jerusalem as a whole, understanding it, feeling a connection to it because they can see its entirety. The shrine here, this is the town of Rocamadour in France. This is where I did most of my anthropological research. And it's another site that's really associated with this view from a distance. It can evoke emotion in people, this idea of seeing something from a distance and taking it all in is very powerful. Then, of course, we move to the overview effect. This is Frank White's idea that has been incredibly influential. I decided to highlight Italy in this photo. And you might think about the way that somebody like Jackie Feldman talks about the power that's given from looking at the entirety of a sacred place. In this case, it relates to the idea of the overview effect. And I've always been interested in Frank White's formulation of the overview effect, looking out an airplane window, where he says, from the airplane, the message that scientists, philosophers, spiritual teachers, and systems theorists have been trying to tell us for centuries was obvious. Everything is interconnected and interrelated, each part a subsystem of a larger whole system. He goes on to say, people living in space settlements will always have an overview. And we see this a lot, especially now that the cupola was built into the International Space Station. Astronauts spend a lot of time talking about looking at the Earth. I've talked to a number of astronauts who are really drawn to being able to see weather patterns or be able to see, they sometimes say there's no borders, but other astronauts will say, yeah, you go at night, you can see the border between South Korea and North Korea very easily. So there's a lot to be said about what human settlements do, but you can see this all from space. In recent years, astronauts have been confined to low Earth orbit, or LEO. This is because the lunar program ended, the US lunar program ended in 1972. When people go into space now, they are generally just either doing a suborbital tourist hop or doing a space shuttle previously until 2011, different space stations, but you're not getting the same view of Earth in both cases. So when we start to think about upcoming lunar missions that are promised to us, and now that they've named a crew, I'm sort of crossing my fingers, you can see a difference here. The image here on the left was by Randolph Bresnik, and he took this during a spacewalk. You can see continents, you can see cloud formations and weather. He really is having quite an overview effect. It's different what you're looking at here in this Apollo 15 photo, where you can see the Earth, it's a crescent Earth, and the amount of information you can glean, or the type of information you can glean, is very different. Here you get a very strong, much stronger sense in the Apollo 15 photo that the Earth is distant, that it's a solitary orb, but you don't get a lot of information about who's living where, what weather patterns are going on. I can see that it's daylight where this crescent is, but I don't know from here what part of the globe I'm looking at. So that's going to change. Seeing the Earth from a distance has been a very moving experience to those astronauts who have traveled away from the Earth enough to see it get smaller in the distance. Michael Collins, he's been quoted already today. His book is fantastic. The vision that I summon over and over again of the itsy bitsy sphere just outside my window, motionless, cradled in black velvet. And then more recently, Fred Hayes from Apollo 13, he was taking photos as they headed to the moon. And he said it was surreal to shoot stills of the shrinking Earth for several hours. I have found it hard to describe the deep emotion I felt viewing these out of this world scenes. And of course, out of this world is kind of a play on words here. I'm very interested from talking to astronauts that I've interviewed. And it's been, I have to, as an anthropologist, it's very important that I keep the anonymity of my research participants in place. It's very difficult with astronauts, as you can imagine. So I give everybody pseudonyms. This is typical in anthropological research. But I also am very careful not to give an exact number of astronauts I've interviewed, because in some cases I've had to split people into two, where it would be giving too much away if what they talked about one topic was associated with what they talk about with another topic. In this case, though, I can use Michael Collins' quote again, and this is coming to the moon and orbiting the moon and seeing it from very close by. And I think, I'm sure that Frank White has talked about this as well, the idea of this being another kind of overview, where once again, you're close up, you're getting a lot of information. And I love this description. Michael Collins says, our first shock comes as we stop our spinning motion and swing ourselves around so as to bring the moon into view. We have not been able to see the moon for nearly a day now, and the change in its appearance is dramatic, spectacular, and electrifying. The moon I have known all my life, that two-dimensional small yellow disk in the sky, has gone away somewhere to be replaced by the most awesome sphere I have ever seen. To begin with, it is huge, completely filling our window. Second, it is three-dimensional. The belly of it bulges out toward us in such a pronounced fashion that I almost feel I can reach out and touch it. And I love that idea of the moon becoming three-dimensional in that proximity. And this can be disturbing by itself. I've had multiple interviews with an astronaut from the Apollo era that I'll call Zach, and he was somebody who was able to visit the moon. And he talked to me about this when we were discussing different visions and different things he'd seen from space. He said, I think the most profound thing I witnessed was seeing the moon up close. The moon's very unfriendly. It's very unforgiving, very, very difficult. I think you look at a scene and you kind of decide in your mind whether it's hostile or not, and that it's not something you want to step out into. The moon is so stark, so sharp, so forbidding that you still have the impression, even inside the spacecraft, that it's a pretty hostile place. And we talked about comparing it to driving across the desert between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, something that we had both done. And the idea that you're safe in your little car with the air conditioning on, but sometimes of the year, if you were to do that, you would be placing your life at risk by leaving. This, of course, would be much more dangerous than getting out of your car in the desert, but a similar feeling of this awareness of hostility outside you. He says, continues, you are so cut off from everything. And here you are, all of a sudden, you're looking at the moon that you probably looked at thousands of times growing up. And here you are anywhere from 16 to 10 miles away from it. And it's different. You can look at the moon and see the dark circles and all that. But when you get close to it and you see the smaller craters and you see how sharply defined they are, and you see the very sharp shadow patterns caused by the sun, well, you're seeing it for the first time. So I'm interested in this sort of deep space view, but I also don't want to lose the fact that when we send people back to the moon, they're going to be encountering another celestial body from up close. And I'm sure we're going to see this a lot as human space travel continues to other bodies in the solar system. So this idea of a galactic panorama is something I'm very interested in because my astronauts that I've interviewed have been very interested in it. I think the term starstruck is interesting because it, of course, is used on Earth to mean that something amazes you and you can't function. And that's a little bit what we're seeing here. And it's not been fully explored. I quoted, I didn't know that was read at the beginning of this program, but what Arthur Woods had said, that we need a definition of the deep space effect. What is it? Is it this? Is it that? And I think, and I'm going to be arguing here, that it is the enrapturing beauty, and it is distance and loneliness. and it's danger, and it's all of these kinds of things, because a lot of it depends on who's having those experiences and what they bring with them. I want to talk a little bit about my ethnographic research on this. Typically, as an anthropologist, the most sort of stereotypical idea is you go off and you live in a little village, you speak the language of the natives, you do what the locals do, and you get as immersed as possible. There's not any kind of space village that I can go to. Space culture is spread out, it's multi-sided. If I could go and spend, a week or a month on the International Space Station doing ethnographic research, that would be fantastic. But the funding just isn't there. I don't have a grant that I can apply for that's going to get me there. So I've relied mostly on going to places where space exploration takes place. JPL, the Kennedy Space Center, the Johnson Space Center. I spent a month living at the Vatican Observatory in Castel Gandolfo, and I am immersing myself as much as I can with people who work in space and know space well, medical conferences, all kinds of things. I've done a lot of interviews with people, and some of those have been astronaut interviews. But at least for me, it's difficult to get interviews with active astronauts. So I've relied mostly on retired astronauts and snowball sampling, where you meet people who introduce you to other people who introduce you to other people. What I've found is that being able to look into deep space as an astronaut with your own eyes, not through photographs or telescopes, is very difficult to make happen. It's not something that's likely to happen accidentally. Of the astronauts I've interviewed, several of them have been able to have this experience. And I first started talking about this in 2018 at an American Anthropological Association panel called Ethnographies of the Extreme. And I kind of like this picture. This ended up on Twitter, and it amuses me because the lights in this building look just enough like a starry sky that I'm happy with the way it turned out. I ended up taking this research and publishing it for the first time in the online journal Religions as part of a special series or a special issue on religion and space that I co-edited. And the article in 2020 was the overview effect and the ultraview effect, how extreme experiences of outer space influence religious beliefs in astronauts. So I'm really coming toward this from my disciplinary perspective. Anthropological research is not broad. Most cultural anthropologists like myself do not conduct surveys. They're not looking for large things. So nothing I'm saying is 100% of astronauts do this or 20% of astronauts do that. Instead, I'm saying in the small sample size that I've done, I've tried to do multiple interviews. Everybody I'm mentioning today, I've done multiple interviews with. I'm trying to have an idea of depth, getting to know people very well, getting them to be comfortable with me, assuring their anonymity. And there's the process of establishing rapport, where once you kind of establish trust, then people tend to open up more. Most astronauts I've spoken to have not looked out into deep space. One of them, who I call Charles, his religious background, which is as an anthropologist of religion is interesting to me, is he was a fundamentalist. He became a Lutheran. I would say he's a fairly liberal Christian. And he was on a space mission where, because of a delay, he was able to Velcro himself into a camera bay. So this was a place where they would normally have a camera looking through the window and have dark cloth and Velcro behind it so that it would be completely dark. He was able to kind of get his head and shoulders into this and get dark adapted in the middle of a busy spacecraft. And he said to me about this, you are very aware of the sky being full of stars, and you're also very aware of the colors of them. I was much more aware of the color and much more aware of the numbers and the patterns. It was just beautiful. But for Charles, this was something that was just a few minutes, maybe 45 minutes of his time during an otherwise busy space mission. Astronauts are always, what they say, chasing the red line. With NASA missions, and I'm sure this is true for any time, other space agencies as well, there are jobs that need to be completed. It's not meant for leisure. You're not having time to just sort of look out the window. That being said, my second case study is an astronaut I call Theo. He says he was raised as a casual Episcopalian. He is one of the most religion chasing people I know, and I mean that in a really good way. Thirsty for experience, open to everybody's religious beliefs, has done a number of different kinds of rituals in space intentionally, and really pursues active and novel religious experiences in space. He's also done some spacewalks. He talked to me about a mission where he wanted to look out into space and was actually thwarted. He said, on one mission, I was never permitted to have a dark experience because the crew were not interested and they wouldn't let me turn all the lights off. They don't care. They don't want to look out the window. You can see galaxies with the naked eye. Galaxies. You're looking for galaxies. You're looking at all this shit going on. But so the mission I flew with, he flew with a friend. The mission I flew with a friend, this was a later mission, I had incredibly considerate people. They may not be in the windows, but they allowed other people to have these night passes. So they allowed him to turn off all the lights in the spacecraft for a while so he could get dark adapted and look out the window. Nobody can ever look out the window at night because it's this level of light where we were. If it's this level of light and you're trying to look out this window to see, you ain't going to see nothing. And then later he described what it was like to be in space during a spacewalk. Also, when you were dark adapted in the spacecraft, he said, you do have an outrageous view of the heavens and you have a different view of Earth. The number of stars you can see in the planets and galaxies with the naked eye, that is. And there's so much out there. You can barely find your own constellations because there is so much you're looking at. The whole sky is full of objects, full of stars. It's a hard wall. The Milky Way is a hard white wall. It's unbelievably solid up there. And then more recently, he said to me in a phone call, you were looking at the galaxies with naked eye. You were in the heavens. Holy shit. You're in a place that will increase spirituality. You'll do the checklist a hell of a lot better if you're on top of your spirituality than if you're not. It's the same as goddamn water or food. And apologies for Theo's language here, but I wanted to reproduce it exactly. And then I wanted to get back to Zach, who is case study number 3, because he's the one who really got me thinking about this. And he was in orbit around the moon. I'm giving a little bit away to say that he was by himself. And he ended up in a shadow. He was in a communication blackout from NASA. He shut off all the lights, got dark adapted, and looked out the window, which would have been Theo's dream. Because Theo was in low Earth orbit. And Zach said, looking at the universe out there from my vantage point, I began to realize that we don't know crap about anything. We really don't. At some points in my orbit around the moon, I was sheltered from both the Earth and the sun, so I was in complete darkness. And all of a sudden, the star patterns out there became something that I was not ready for. So many stars I couldn't see one, just a sheet of light. I don't know whether you'd call it spiritual or not, but when I saw the star field out there in a way that nobody else has ever seen, I had some pretty profound thoughts. We are not unique in the universe. And then he said, when I came back from my flight, we were all totally exhausted. I'd sit in my living room and all these thoughts would come flowing through. So I began writing them down. They flowed from my mind through a pen onto a piece of paper. It was like I was being guided by something. And with the recent news, at least in the States, Zach became, this is coincidental, but Zach became convinced that life on Earth came from an alien source, that spacefaring aliens from other places had been responsible for starting the human race on Earth. And this was something he was pretty frank about in our discussions, which surprised me when I first met him. So to kind of talk about the ultra view versus the overview effect, I think And I'm sure Frank White would have more to say on this. It seems to clarify what is viewed, at least from the initial definition. I find the ultra view effect doesn't clarify, but it really emphasizes and highlights things that we don't know. The idea we don't know crap, right? That is not the most beautiful way to state it, but looking out into this wall of white, this solid sheet, and realizing you know nothing. This connects to, it's a hugely kind of spiritual moment that we see people having in other circumstances, but this seems to be one that's a very strong way to get that. It's very rare to experience. I hope you're getting the impression from what I told you about Theo and Charles and Zach that it's not easy to do. You cannot just say, I'm going to go up as an astronaut and look into space. Circumstances have to be perfect. It's unsettling, it's upsetting. From Theo, who's very open to things, it's thrilling. It needs to be processed. And some astronauts like Theo see it as transformative, revealing, or deeply spiritual. And I think about, NASA sending people out there. I also think about Dear Moon. And I think probably it will be pursued for Dear Moon. I think maybe NASA would seek to, I don't know if they're going to let people have it or avoid it or what, because there's some issues that need to be dealt with. I've talked previously, and I wanted to touch on here, Timothy Morton's idea of hyperobjects. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but Timothy Morton talks about that there are these ideas, these phenomena, these things that are real, that are so huge that the human mind is incapable of taking them all in at once. We see little bits of them. So we might notice glaciers melting, but not really understand the impact of global climate change initially. We might see the moon from a distance and it looks like a flat mirror. But then when we use technology to get closer, we have like the more awareness of the reality of it. And apparently, and I think he's got something here, Timothy Morton says that becoming aware of these hyperobjects where we've seen just little bits and pieces of them and they've been comprehensible or seem to be, once you realize the enormity, it's just so painful and so disturbing that he talks about it being, people responding with disgust or pain. I want to talk a little bit, though, that cultural priming seems to have a lot to do with how people respond. And this is a completely different area, but it made me think of it. Tanya Luhrmann, who was one of my professors at UC San Diego, has done some work on schizophrenia with a group of other researchers. And they studied the symptoms of people who heard voices in the United States, India, South India, and Ghana, and noticed that cultural conditioning, the background, how they were primed, the way they thought about themselves as individuals, influenced the way that they understood these voices. And in both Ghana and South India, the people there would often have very positive responses to hearing these voices, hearing family members, having conversations, whereas Americans, US Americans, in their sample, there wasn't a single person who had a positive experience. It was also always seen as invasive, always seen as disturbing. And they argue, Luhrmann et al. Argued that it might have to do with this American value of individuality. The idea of the self is impermeable in a way that maybe other cultures don't share. So I thought this was an example of something that could be disturbing, but depending on your cultural background, it could be more or less disturbing based on how prepared you are to have an experience like that. There are also psychological responses to awe that play into this that I think are important. And I have to say, Tanya Luhrmann was professor at UC San Diego, which has a strong psychological anthropology background. So I touch on this a little bit. Joan, Verputten, Valdesolo, and Graham have written papers that talk about awe as being something that shakes the person that experiences it. And as opposed to disgust, you can have a growth experienced as a response to it. And religion can also be a way of handling the unsettled feeling Whereas there's some indication that if you have an extremely unsettling experience, the search for an explanation can lead to a religious or supernatural explanation, which can then in turn be comforting. So there are ways that we can deal with something unsettling that make it a little easier to deal with. Also, an article by Joie and DeWitt talking about vastness. They look at religious monumental architecture like pyramids and cathedrals and say that when people first encounter them, they often just freeze in their tracks. And that this seems to be something with an evolutionary bias. We're in sort of cognitive anthropology here, or cognitive psychology. But that response to the vastness is something that could slow reaction times. And so it's interesting to me to imagine somebody first catching this glimpse of the solid white wall and freezing. They need to be in a position where they can have downtime, where they can freeze, where they can process what's going on. And I think when we do have space tourism that becomes, lunar, that's probably likely to be something that is sought by people. Some final thoughts. I think the return to the moon and other lunar missions and Mars missions are going to be able to give people more of an opportunity. The suborbital flights that we see with Blue Origin, with Virgin Galactic, who just kind of went back up a couple weeks ago, those are not going to give any kind of chance to look into deep space. Especially with 4 minutes. It's just, you're never going to be dark adapted. It's not going to happen. But as we go further out into space, there may be some things to think about in terms of commercial applications. But this is a very limited sample of people who've experienced it. And I think these initial findings are intriguing, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done on this. So I'm trying to point people in this direction and encourage more research. So that's that. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dana. That was great. Fantastic.
Thank you.
So Christopher, you're next on. Are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go. And is my audio okay?
Yes.
Okay, let me start the screen share. I have minimalist slides compared to Dina's. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, let me start the slideshow. Okay. So just some very quick reactions. I love your work, Dina. It's really terrific. And so it's really cool to be a part of this with you. Just a handful of quick things and like some conjunctions I think that we may hear in the talks. I'm also going to talk about vistas through the history of the sublime. I've got some stuff at the end about the moon, since I'm writing a book about the moon. And I think this question of processing and you're absolutely right. The amount of time, the mission tasks, the checklist on the cuffs and so forth, really mitigates against creative expression and sort of just first emotional processing for the astronauts. And so, as a writer, as a poet, I just keep thinking, the space agencies need poets to train these astronauts in everything from metaphor to iambic pentameter, at least in English. And I too have had the difficulty of like trying to reach through the perhaps necessary crust of public affairs officers around the active astronaut corps, even just to do journalistic interviews about geological training. It's very difficult, and maybe that's another thing to talk about. And just now a correction, I'm actually no longer an associate professor. I'm a emeritus. I retired early. This is my first presentation as an emeritus faculty member. I retired last week, which has been good. So I'm very happy. Yes, some smiles there. So I'm going to talk about awe through the context of the sublime. I too have some questions about additional research that needs to be done. And let me just get to my talk. I think what I'm going to do is read and then put the slides up as needed. unless, hold on one second. Sorry, having a little bit of technical slowdown as always. All right, let's try that again. Okay, so you have my definition of the sublime there, okay. And is that all you see is just my slide?
We can see the slide and also the thumbnails on the side.
Okay. Okay. It's not quite sure how, I haven't used Zoom in quite a while. I've been using a different application. Well, in any case, let me just get started, and I'm going to read as we go. So again, thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to share the stage a little bit with Dina and her work. Really appreciated her talk. So I am a practitioner and student of the sublime, whether I'm encountering a bobcat on a desert bike trail or reading about the technological sublime at 11,000 feet, which I did one summer as I was preparing a course on the technological sublime. I thought it would be cool to read about it while I was up in the mountains, or looking at the moon through a telescope. And I've taught the sublime and the grotesque in a variety of classes for more than 3 decades, teaching science fiction, American studies, courses on deep time and space as well. So, of course, most of us here know that Frank White popularized the term the overview effect. One of his definitions, I believe it's the first one in his first book, was seeing and feeling the unity of Earth from space. And over the decades, it's come to suggest, and I think Dina's already indicated, some hesitations here that we should bear in mind, but it has come to suggest, or that we have assumed, that nearly all space travelers experience this, a subsequent and long-lasting sense of community with the Earth, a sense of the lack of political boundaries and what that suggests about human possibility, and a subsequent altruism, compassion. It doesn't appear to me that anyone's really put the overview effect, or might call it maybe more accurately the overview experience, since the effects are maybe still a little unknown, in conversation with literary and cultural understandings of the sublime. And in fact, the word sublime doesn't actually occur in the index, or as I reread the text, I didn't find it in Frank's original edition of the book. But I think that talking about the sublime historically, conceptually, physically, can help elucidate some issues. Until the mid-20th century, and I'm talking about the Western experience here, so I have to be very clear about my standpoint. The sublime in nature was largely associated with elite white male experiences, primarily sporting and recreational. And that remains much of the, most of the composition of space travelers, elite white males. There's also a suggestion that altitude, or vistas, Dina was talking about vistas, can reinforce a sense of control and power. And so I think that's also noteworthy given the rise of very wealthy space tourism. So to be very clear, I'm a proponent of human space exploration. It's clear that many astronauts have experienced the sublime, awe, the overview effect. I think all of that is to the good. But I do have some hesitations about some claims that are made on its behalf as a sort of automatic good in terms of social utility, widespread social utility, in a sort of justification for human spaceflight by itself. That maybe is a separate conversation. So I'm going to talk about all of these things, the extent, the duration, consequences of sublime experiences in space. Really, we need more research. So let me start with the discussion of the sublime. This is like the world's fastest history definitions of the sublime. So we're talking about the natural sublime, as many of you may know this from your own background. So that, as I define it, a momentary encounter with an object or phenomenon that inspires fear-tinged awe, but does not present as a mortal threat. It's not going to kill you, but the self is temporarily subsumed, rationality, language subsumed under an overwhelming or nearly overwhelming sensation of perception. So I always put it to my students this way. And I use the Grand Canyon because I'm in the American West. So if you were to look at the Grand Canyon from a fair distance, like say a roadside rest, you're not approaching the edge, you might be experiencing the scenic sort of touristic experience. It might verge into the sublime. If you're at the edge of the Grand Canyon, or like just past the guardrail, if you've ever been there, you have a better chance of experiencing the sublime. You could be awed by the horizon of rock, the tortured depths of the canyon. It's still not necessarily going to happen to you based on your own predispositions culturally and individually. But you have a better chance of experiencing that sense of awe, of being overwhelmed. Now, if you're at the edge and it begins to crumble and you're losing your balance, the sublime now becomes, and I intend this pun, sheer terror, right? You could die. So those are some of those gradations. So that's a quick, sort of way of thinking about the sublime. Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, wrote really interesting work on the sublime. Describes two kinds: the mathematical, which is concerned with vast scale, doesn't necessarily mean algebra, and the dynamic, which is concerned with forces like storms. I'm going to leave Edmund Burke and about 3 centuries of other thinkers aside now. So a history of the sublime. And can you see the book recommendations I just gave you? Okay, great. So we take sublime landscapes for granted, but we shouldn't. There's a history to their reception in the West that includes, for example, and I love this, that travelers in carriages going through the Alps and other mountain ranges in Europe in the 18th century would shutter their windows in the carriages because the rugged terrain reminded them of Satan. It was ungodly. It was chaotic. It was grotesque. Jeffrey Galt Harpham has a beautiful way of thinking about the grotesque. He says it is, quote, the perception that something is illegitimately in something else. So it's sort of this sort of unwelcome penetration. And a lot hinges on that adverb. So, what is grotesque to one person might not be grotesque to another or to one species. So as urbanization and industrialization spreads across Europe and North America, especially in the East in the 18th and 19th centuries, this nostalgia, as I think we probably all know, sets in, this nostalgia for the bucolic, for the pastoral, and a desire to encounter nature, capital N nature, in its most dramatic expressions. Think of Wordsworth, Schiller, John Muir. And again, this has to be emphasized, largely a male, white, upper-class pursuit until the rise of popular tourism, ironically made possible by technology like railroads and automobiles. And then we see crowds, we see tourism, we see people going to places like Niagara Falls, where, again, another irony, if they're primed by materials that they've read about Niagara Falls, and David Nye writes about this, they often fail to experience the sublime, because they've been primed in certain ways with this touristic literature. In any case, nature tourism does begin to shed the sort of gendered and racial restrictions into the 20th century, and the rise of transcendentalism could be pointed to as well as popularizing nature as a way to commune with the divine or aspects of the divine. So in this Western context, my briefest history of the sublime has 3 phases. The first is rejection. The second is innovator acceptance, leading to a broader acceptance. And then the third, sort of where we are now in some cases, is democratization to the point of banality. So including promotional and virtual encounters that can trigger disappointment among those going to, like the Grand Canyon, a commodified location of the sublime. If you've been to a place like that and you're surrounded by a bunch of people, maybe it's harder to have those kinds of experiences. Again, there's a cultural inflection here that I can't get into, but there's been research on this regarding, say, how people in China react to sublime experiences versus in the United States. Having said that, prior scientific knowledge can enhance one's readiness for an appreciation of the sublime. Here, as Dina has done, I can just kind of gesture to those interviews, those testimonials, memoirs, poetry of the astronauts. I'm particularly interested in the Apollo 15 crew, which was the first heavily trained, geologically trained mission. And science led all of them to experiences of the sublime. You can see it in the transcripts from the Surface Journal transcripts and in the flight transcripts as well. More to say about that too. So let me move on. Sorry to be reading fast. I want to make sure we have time to talk about this together. So I want to move on to altitude and the technological sublime. There are many kinds of the sublime. We've been talking about the natural, this ultra view effect, natural sublime, made possible by technology, but nonetheless. There's the temporal sublime, architectural, even a sexual sublime, the technological. So there are all these different varieties. First used by Perry Miller, the term technological sublime, according to David Nye in his book, which I love and recommend, is that feeling of awe at technical, rational human achievements. In other words, it moves away from the natural to what we have achieved. So instead of the canyon, it's the bridge across the canyon. Instead of a mountain, it's a skyscraper. Instead of a storm, it's the explosion of an atomic bomb seen from, quote unquote, a safe distance, if there is such. And if it's experienced in a collective way, say at a rocket launch, the technological sublime is a chance at a communal kind of secular and or quasi-religious experience. And I bring this into the conversation because spaceflight is an example par excellence of the technological sublime. It is an expression of power. It's manifestly about scale, about height. It embraces the dynamic sublime in liftoff and reentry, those powerful forces, the mathematical sublime in terms of those views. So I want to talk a little bit about height, altitude, and how it's been understood in the history of the sublime first. So as I have up here on the screen, art historian Carol Fabricant has pointed out that in the 18th century, mountaintops and other high places were central features of aristocratic landscapes, where from such heights, the spectator, like a lord overseeing his creation, was able to command a view of the country stretching out beneath him and thereby exert control over it in much the same way that the ruling class, the aristocratic class, ruled over those on the lower rungs of the social hierarchy. Two other examples from the history of aviation. This is from 1911, Harper's Magazine. This is a New York Times science writer saying this about aviation, quote, "Swifter than any storm will be the flight of its pilot. If the black looming," I love this prose, it's so purple. "If the black looming maelstrom of the cyclone looms up before him, he can make a detour or even outspeed it. For the velocity of his machine will be greater than that of the fiercest howling wintry blasts. At a gale at which drives every aviator timorously to cover, he snaps a contemptuous finger, plunges through it in a breathless dash, and emerges again in sunshine, as indifferent to his experience as a locomotive engineer after running through a drizzling rain." And then there's this quote from Charles Lindbergh, 1927, after his Atlantic crossing. He said, quote, "Sometimes the world from above seems too beautiful, too distant for human eyes to see, like a vision at the end of life forming a bridge to death. When one obtains too great vision, is there some power that draws one from mortal life forever? Will it deaden his senses and let him fly on without the vision?" As private space tourism continues, largely for the extremely rich, one has to wonder if they're experiencing or will experience a sense of command and control, or the more kinship-oriented versions of the overview effect. And the fact is, we don't know. What we do know is that the brains of the very wealthy and powerful are wired differently. Berkeley psychologist Paul Piff and I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, Dacre Keltner, have found that the rich are less compassionate, they're less empathetic, they're more selfish. Both Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk espouse, and in the former case at least practice, altruism while running exploitative companies with sexist, racist, and hostile work environments decoupled from anything other than efficiency. The less well-off, like most of us, I hope, right, are, to be blunt, we care more. The rich care less. Just to underscore that point, they're less attentive to others. They have trouble reading emotional and social cues, and they tend to agree that greed has intrinsic value. After Bezos flew on his flight, David Yearning, a psychiatrist and behavioral sciences researcher at Johns Hopkins, raised some questions about this. And he said, quote, "Most astronauts talk about the view and how it transformed their values. I think the test of whether Bezos's flight was a glorified roller coaster ride or whether it was more like true spaceflight will be determined from his actions going forward." And he goes on to say, "I have little doubt that Bezos experienced awe from perceptual vastness, but did he experience conceptual vastness from realizing that we're all in this world together and that Earth's situation is fragile?" Personally, I think we need to be more careful in promulgating spaceflight as a purely epiphanic good, as though justified by the perspectives embraced by some, not all, space travelers. After all, a sense of borderless affinity and interconnectedness has long been part of indigenous traditions, none of whom needed rockets to achieve that connection. In African traditions, and some of them, this is called Ubuntu. The philosopher Martin Buber called it I, thou. In the Indian ethos of Vasudha Kutumbakam, the entire earth is my family. So I'm going to turn to Alan Wallach to close out this portion of the talk, another cultural historian who writes that the panorama, and in this case, he's writing specifically about, if you've been to museums, art museums that have these circular rooms, right, where the panorama was painted, or you would have a canvas that you could hand crank, and you would see the panorama, sort of passing in front of you. It was the first, I like to think of it as the first virtual reality experience. Alan Wallach says that the panorama turns aesthetic in, this almost identical relationship between subject and object, and offers the thrill of visual mastery, what he calls the panoptic sublime. And it's not far from that, or what Foucault calls the sovereign gaze, to the aesthetics of surveillance. So again, this question of power and control gets sort of mixed up into it. On the other hand, the encounter with the view of the planet, partial or entire, is, as Dina was telling us, an encounter with a hyperobject, to use that term from Timothy Morton, the supersensible or nearly supersensible thing. Climate change is a hyperobject, by the way. But this can be a powerful inducement to positive shifts in awareness, though again, to what extent, we don't know. Which brings me to some of the research. Again, I'm writing in this way as a writer, as a science writer. It's a little out of my wheelhouse as a professional. I'm not a neuroscientist, although that would be cool. What we know about the neuroscience of awe is that it is largely a positive emotion. These awesome, grand, sublime experiences can lift us out of the drag of the ordinary, the friction of the familiar, into a wider and wilder cosmos. It can make us feel small. To have a sublime experience, you are made to feel small. And at the same time, paradoxically ennobled. It can make us better humans. And the philosopher Emily Brady puts it this way: the sublime in nature can come to symbolize something beyond human control and thereby teach us humility and respect. Learning humility goes hand in hand with valuing things for their own sake. Now, that can be turned against us. I'm quoting here from Michelle Chioda, who's from Arizona State, who says that our propensity for awe can be used by cult leaders, dictators, conspiracy theory pushers, and religious extremists. But of course, we have the chance to craft social norms to protect against such abuse, and instead seek out the sublime in technological ways and in the more than human world. I mean, referencing, the very delicate moment that democracy is in right now. In my life, right, I can look into a ravine and see a Steller's jay, a badger looking up from its burrow out in the wilderness, or in an urban setting, just the outline of a tree and a skyscraper against the blue sky. Those experiences can be deeply pleasant and centering, as she puts it, and they've been found, again, this is her language, to promote a heightened concern for others, feelings of connectedness, humility, helping of strangers, pro-environmental attitudes, and behavioral intentions. Other researchers like Paul Piff at UC Irvine emphasizes that awe can make us more altruistic and ethical. How long those positive effects last is the subject of further inquiry. So it's one thing to say in say a lab experiment, that you having, a virtual experience of awe, as some of the research studies have set out, and then you perform more ethically or more altruistically in a lab experiment. That's one thing versus in 10, 20, 15 years down the line, are you still cultivating awe, and is that having that sort of effect? So the duration of this, consequences of this is open-ended. Shioda and others have found that what they call awe-prone people are particularly comfortable with revising their mental representations of the world. And there's other work that suggests awe-prone people are more creative, and that the feelings of what researchers call the small self can connect us to a strong sense of personal meaning, a sense of religious and spiritual well-being, personal well-being, and a more expansive sense of the present and of time in general. More there that I could say, but I will pass through that. So speaking anecdotally here, I mean, as a writer, less academically rigorously than what an ethnographer or cultural anthropologist does with those intense, in-depth interviews, I would just say, like, in my personal sphere, I know 2 to 3 dozen environmentalists, okay? People who are activists on behalf of the more than human world. They will happily call themselves tree huggers, right? And I would say, and many of them would agree with this, like the strong majority of them are also actually pretty awful people in other contexts, interpersonally, socially, and so forth. So again, just looking at how this sort of plays out through all the variables of our lives is really complicated, and it's going to require a lot more work. David Yearning and his fellow writers in a 2016 paper said this, it's talking about the astronauts in particular, quote, although feelings of awe and self-transcendence associated with the overview effect are episodic, astronauts' experiences may, and I'm emphasizing that, may sometimes settle into long-term changes in personal outlook and attitude involving the individual's relationship to Earth and its inhabitants. These changes seem primarily to entail greater affiliation with humanity as a whole. So this is testable. The extent, the duration, the consequences of experiencing the overview effect, as with any sublime experience, are surely variable. They're not yet deeply understood. And the research, and I think as we heard just a few minutes ago, necessarily is like focused on using astronaut interviews, which are already hard to get. Right. So how hard will it be to get NASA to agree to take astronauts out of one can, as I put it, and put them in another, take them out of the capsule and put them in an fMRI scanner? Really hard. OK. In her dissertation, I hope I'm pronouncing Frank White's colleague's name correctly, Anahit Nizami, who interviewed 7 people, about 600 people have flown to space. She calls for follow-up interviews with these participants, again, requiring a great deal of complex work for long-term permission and participation, especially if you're working in an academic setting and you have to go through an institutional review board. Yearning is interested in plans that would include brain scans, again, and I think that's absolutely necessary for understanding at the neurological level what is happening when people experience the sublime. Extraordinarily difficult. I want to just pause for a second here and say that scholars, we heard this just about a half hour ago, have noted the difficulty of astronauts in communicating their experiences, and there is a long theme in studies of the sublime debating whether sublime experiences can be represented at all in any medium. Knowing they're speaking to those interested in hearing about awe, there may well be a little bit of a selection bias effect in how the astronauts speak of it. Jordan Brim has written about this and says that the history of space psychology provides reason to doubt the veracity of astronaut self-reporting and suggests how the standard conversion narrative has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, another interesting complexity. So there is no doubt that astronauts experience sublime views of the Earth, and that apart from personal testimonials, journalistic, academic, more rigorous documentation needs to take place. Follow-up surveys and neuroimaging are needed to truly test whether the over effect is an effect and what that might do for the very wealthy. To put it another way, would Elon Musk become a caring human being instead of a high-functioning sociopath if he saw the Earth from orbit? I don't know. And again, anecdotally, I have spoken with some astronauts as well, one of whom was not prevented from embracing conspiracy theories about the false imposition of Sharia law in England. So his, that is. I'll just let that stand. Another astronaut, Eileen Collins, and was in the news. I don't need to sort of not say who this was. Came under fire for speaking at a political convention on behalf of an authoritarian political candidate who had bragged about sexually assaulting women. So we have some counterexamples here. We face wicked problems: climate change, systemic oppression, income inequality, and I think that spaceflight, both crewed and uncrewed, is deeply important. But I know from personal experience and from the science, what we're hearing today, that perspective shifts toward unity, kinship, and compassion are also available here on Earth in a staggering array of contexts. One is looking at the night sky, and I say that at the same time we're struggling with preserving the night sky, preserving the view of the Milky Way from here, which is being, extincted from many, many, many places. Other ways of developing that sense of unity and kinship that are also low cost or free include meditation. So we have a lot here in this mix. I want to say a little bit about the deep space views and this question of terror. I'm going to quote again from Deanna in her great piece on Shatner's experience. And she says, among the astronauts I've interviewed as a cultural anthropologist, most have had some experience of the overview effect, but others were unaffected. And then she quotes Shatner, or so she says of Shatner's experience, that he saw death and lived to tell the tale spontaneously and honestly about the enormity and quickness and suddenness of life and death. I was, just amazed by his reaction and how articulate he was. And it's like, oh, well, of course he is. He's an artist. He has that sense of preparation. I want to raise a possibility to use something called terror management theory as a lens through which to look at space travel. Terror management theory is a school of social psychology that finds, contrary to the positive kinship effects of awe and the sublime, that reminders of mortality, especially those that are unconscious, reinforce pre-existing biases and will make one more hostile to outgroups. And this might actually be put in conversation with the historical ideas of a breakaway effect, which were brought up in the early space age, even before actual space flight, when there were high altitude stratospheric balloon flights, and concern that the pilots would experience that sort of sense of disconnection, what sometimes we call the 1,000-yard stare, that afflicts combatants and refugees and explorers in places like Antarctica behind me, which I experienced. I experienced suicidal ideation in this place. So I can attest to the difficulties of those sorts of environments. I was awed and then crushed by that place. But I want to end on a note of uplift. I'm not addicted to the sublime. I think some astronauts probably are, at least some people I've talked to are pilots, mountaineers, others. But I do seek it out, and it's available really to all of us. The empty lot in an urban setting is a battleground of predation. Any garden or park is the result of what Dylan Thomas called the green fuse that drives the flower. In less built places, the human attenuates into enormous, majestically visible evidence of what David Abram, the ecologist, calls the more than human world. And you can experience the beautiful and the sublime simultaneously. Once I was on a mountain slope with my wife, covered in bluebells, and standing over a canyon which had been cut by a river over millions of years. And there was a thunderhead that was, the size of a mountain, just churning black there was lightning. We hustled down the mountain. In that moment, we experienced the beautiful, the dynamic sublime, the mathematical sublime, the temporal sublime, all at once. And I recognize the privilege of my standpoint being able to do that. Not everyone can. There are gentler moments, for example, looking at the moon. And I'll just close with a few photos and a little bit of prose from my book on the history of the moon, a natural and human history of the moon. So I've used telescopes, mostly small ones, not the large one here at Mount Wilson. My first view of the crater Copernicus was through a 10-inch telescope in Tucson. And there was a sharpness there that I had never experienced before, a sort of preternatural clarity of edges and shadows. And I swept over the craters of the lunar highlands, over solid lunar seas, and moved along a white ray of ejecta that I knew led back to Copernicus, like a point on a compass rose. I was 250,000 miles away, but the magnification put me virtually at about 1,500 miles above the lunar surface. And it was shockingly exact. It was a night of very steady air. And so the hummocks, these low angled hummocks, look like, a frozen froth of mud that a child had crafted. It mounted up from the plains to the circular rim. One side of the rim was in shadow, the other was white rock and sun, and there was a gray and black and Arctic white cascade of amphitheater walls and landslides having fallen in other ages, and the sun-bright central mountain peaks shining like a row of spotlights. It was an amazing view, and it really set me on this journey. And that journey continued here with going to Mount Wilson last month to use the 60-inch telescope, which was really the first modern telescope. It was built to have multiple kinds of instrumentation and different kinds of focal lengths. This is obviously a photo of this telescope. It's overshadowed by the 100-inch hooker that Hubble used to discover the expansion of the universe. You can actually buy time on these telescopes. They're the largest telescopes in the world that the public can use. So my very last research dollars from the University of Arizona bought me a night with the 60-inch telescope. And there's a view looking through the slit of the observatory. And here is an eyepiece view. It's difficult for me to convey in the time I have left. I'm going to wrap this up. How absolutely precise this was. This doesn't convey the steadiness of the air. According to my guides that night, it was one of the 2 or 3 steadiest nights they had ever had. And in contrast to the 10-inch telescope and high magnification, this one was as though it was about 400 miles over the lunar surface. So it was a pretty amazing experience. So I'll close. Thank you all. I want to thank Frank White. Again, some hesitations that I've indicated here, but I want to acknowledge and thank him for his pioneering interviews. Panelists, organizers, and audience, and happy to engage in a conversation with you all.
Thank you so much, Chris. Fantastic. Both presentations were really good. And I think Giulio would like to make some comments on here before he has to leave. So we give the floor to Giulio for a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Arthur. And in fact, unfortunately, I'll have to leave in about 10 minutes or maybe 15, but this was a great webinar with 2 really excellent talks, and thank you very much for inviting me. It was really a cultural experience. Now, the first and the second of this series of webinars were with Frank White, which we all know and admire. I just want to mention that after the second webinar, I had a pretty long one-on-one conversation with Frank about pretty much the very things that we have been discussing today. You'll find this conversation in both audio only and video form through my website, which is turingchurch.com. If the URL is not clear, please email me or I will put it in the chat after I finish speaking. in the conversation with Frank, it is clear that both he and I are very interested in the spiritual aspects of space flight. Space flight now, and hopefully human space expansion tomorrow. And yes, to me, this is like a personal religion. In fact, space is a cornerstone of my personal religion. And when I think of what to me sound is more like a religious service that I want to attend, I think of space launches. That was exactly the feeling I had when I followed the unfortunately not entirely successful first launch of a spaceship a couple of months, a few weeks ago, actually. Now, this thing that today has been called the sense of the sublime, and by Diane hyperobject, being in the awesome presence of hyperobjects, I think it's something that we very much need for the very survival of our culture and our society. It is important to give as many people as possible the full opportunity to experience these feelings. And one of my comments in the last discussion of what we were calling the deep space effects, and we have been calling the ultra view effects today, is that you don't even need to go to space to experience that, because it's something that we can all experience from here, down on the earth, looking at the clear night sky. And we can do it all the time, and I do it all the time. Again, it's like a personal religious event to me, looking at the stars and imagining a human civilization that is spreading to the solar system first and to the stars later. Diane mentioned that one of the less appreciated functions of modern science and technology is to put us more deeply in touch with the unseen world, the unknown, what is still beyond our understanding. And as a matter of fact, I have recently written a little something on my website, turingchurch.com, about the philosophical movement of the Italian futurists. Sorry, I'll have to move because there is some background noise here. The Italian futurists were a cultural movement that started in Italy at the beginning of the 20th century. And one of their more paradoxical points was that the objective of science is to put us in touch with the mystery that comes from the yet unknown parts of the world. There is a very interesting piece of writing called Manifesto of Futurist Science that says exactly that. It's not available in English translation, but I have translated some key passages myself. And you find this piece in my website, turingchurch.com. Now, connecting this with the ultra view effect, I have said that you don't even need to go to space to experience the ultra view effect. But of course, the effect would be much more pronounced if we experience it from space. And now I'm thinking of all these projects that we keep hearing about, like establishing an astronomical observatory on the far side of the moon. Is still something halfway between reality and science fiction, but hopefully, if the current return to the moon will continue to be successful and we will establish a permanent human presence on the moon, that will be perhaps in 30 or 40 years, something like that, a science facility and astronomical observatory on the far side of the moon. Now, that will happen at a time when we will have very immersive virtual reality technology that will allow everyone to experience through the web whatever it is that the astronomers and scientists are seeing in deep space from the moon. And that's something I very much look forward to. I won't be there by that time. I don't think so. But I'm happy for our children and the grandchildren who will have the opportunity to experience more and more the ultraview effect and the world-changing magic of the sublime. And I'd like to end here. I have so many other things to say, and I look forward to establishing communication via email with the speakers. It was really a great event. And okay, Arthur, I'm giving the floor back to you, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Giulio, for your comments. Remo, what about from you? We haven't heard from you today. Remo?
It's coming.
Okay.
Here I am. Yes, I'd like to ask a question. I have a question for Dina. You talked about ex voto, objects that have been taken from space at Earth, and that gain a sort of religious meaning, also commercial, I understand. But what about the objects that astronauts brought and even smuggled to the moon? Do you think that they did so for some sort of religious feeling?
I think it always depends, and thank you for your question. Obviously, some of the objects that astronauts brought were for religious purposes. So Buzz Aldrin taking communion on the moon is one of the most famous examples of that. Other objects, I've talked to astronauts who, you know, had a different crucifix per mission that they always had with them. But I think some of the objects don't. So I can't remember if it was a Mercury or a Gemini mission, but somebody brought a sandwich with them into space. I don't think that was meant to have any kind of religious meaning. I think that was more of a prank or a joke. But I think in a lot of cases, something is made more special by going into space, and that often has personal reasons. One of the non-religious astronauts I interviewed took soil, dirt, from the pitcher's mound of his favorite baseball team and got some from the team, took that with him into space, and then gave it back to them. But he told me he secretly kept part of it for himself because it was something that was associated with his favorite sports team, but also had been in space. Obviously, fewer objects were brought to the moon, but you definitely have people leaving things behind. So the ex voto is generally like you show you've made the trip by leaving something of yourself. A red Bible was left on the surface of the moon. The fallen astronaut statue that was there, the Charlie Duke's picture of his family. I think those would all count as ex votos. But the idea of this sort of transformation of objects when you make them space flown, for some people that holds tremendous spiritual value, even if the person who took it didn't see it that way. And I don't know, one of the astronauts I interviewed compared it, this person was Catholic and spontaneously compared it to having something blessed. And when I was at the Vatican Observatory during that trip, I was able to have, a large audience with the Pope. I picked up 30 rosaries ahead of time to have those all blessed. And they meant a lot to the people that I gave them to because they'd been through that experience and they sort of contain the essence of that. And I think space-flown objects contain that essence, at least in our imagination. Long answer, sorry.
Thank you.
We have a question from the questionette from Lisa, one of our Moon Village Cultural Consideration members who's very active. And she asks to Christopher, can you comment on the importance of including creative people on future space missions who are trained in expressing sublime experiences? Would this benefit all cultures?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all, and hi Lisa. good to yes, I mean, I think it's crucial, and I have an extended sort of meditation on this in the book, coming out next year, and it's become clear over the past 3 or 4 years of my kind of immersion in this that there is a great deal of agency and bureaucratic resistance to any kind of creative communication, expression, preparation, or training. Al Warden talks about this in his memoir, Story Musgrave. We actually, in the poetry anthology Beyond Earth's Edge, we publish one of Al's poems in two poems by Story Musgrave. And in corresponding with him, he said very clearly, it's like, that NASA doesn't want us to have that, So it may well be that other agencies will be more open to it, and maybe ironically, some of the private space tourism companies will be more open to this. But even they have sort of bottom line issues, that there's only so much preparation that they can do, and none of these entities are really turning a profit, So there are a number of variables that go into this. But yes, I think it is important, and it may seem sort of antiquated to argue for that sense of verbal and written capacity, the kind of capacity that you find in poets and other kinds of writers, because the culture of communicating space experiences is so visual, and necessarily so. But we are so awash in images, and how many more tweets do we need of this versus someone being able to testify in the moment the power of this experience. And I think the Artemis 3 crew, there will be some, I've watched with great interest what they're able to express in the moment. So I would just leave you with the thought, how many phrases or expressions, sentences, do we all remember culturally that come from the surface of the moon? And I think maybe most of us would have one, possibly two, and none of them really convey, with the possible exception of Buzz Aldrin saying magnificent desolation, none of them really convey the sublime nature of the moon. So I think it's crucial. It's going to be an uphill battle to try to get some of that sort of in front of the people who make those decisions.
Well, Dana mentioned the Dear Moon mission, and the Dear Moon mission actually he's found some artists to have that experience.
Yeah,
so we're hoping that mission will give us this kind of reaction from a different perspective. So that's very interesting. Hope that it's going to work. We have another question here. Sublime is a momentary experience, or does it last forever? Is sublime a momentary experience, or does it last forever? I guess that's
I'll answer briefly, and I'd love to hear my colleagues' response to that too. It is by sort of by definition, it is a momentary experience. It would be hard to have a sublime experience that lasts forever. The question is, how do you represent it to yourself, and how do you represent it to others? Like, what is it doing for you? And as I said, I think those of us who have had the privilege for variety of cultural and economic reasons to seek out the sublime, it becomes part of who we are. But yeah, I don't know. Dina, do you have other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think by necessity, it's temporary. I think you can't maintain it because it would wear off, right? It's a change in what your normal experience is. But I think people can seek it out. I was thinking too, when you were answering the last question, I'm familiar, I know a linguist named Sherry Wells Jensen, who's done a lot for disability research in space. And she is blind from birth. And it's, interesting to me to try to imagine the understanding and experience of space of somebody who has no visual reference. And I was listening to you thinking about, I wonder whether something like Dear Moon could also focus on other sensory experiences of space that we don't think about as much. There could be, you know, the sublime sound. I mean, I know in space, no one can, you know, there's no sound in space, but there could be something on the surface of Mars, right? When we heard the wind, listening to some of the recordings that the rovers have made. Or there was an attempt a while ago to have a smell of space that you could send away for. It wasn't very nice, I'll say that. I do have a bottle of that. So I think the idea of the sublime is that it has to necessarily stand in contrast to normalcy. And if you don't have normalcy, then you don't have the sublime.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. Like it is very visually biased. And I know we're short on time here. I just want to briefly mention that there were two analog missions that were run. They were the first two missions at a new facility at Biosphere 2 at the University of Arizona, where I used to work. And that facility is called SAM, S-A-M, Space Analog for Moon and Mars. And those first two analog missions were with a diverse set of applicants who were differently abled. And so, which I think is very cool. So, you know, I'm interested in that moving forward as well. So thanks for that corrective.
Sure.
Okay, Arthur, what do you think? Should we close this very interesting webinar?
Yeah, I think we've hit our time limit. So it's been fantastic. Great discussion. And I'd like to see it go on in different ways.
Yeah, I very much appreciate the chance to talk to you all today and to meet everybody. And the invitation is wonderful, and your work, Christopher, is very, very interesting. There's a lot now that I'm going to pursue, including the Turing Church. I just wanted to point out to folks in the chat, he put turingchurch.com. It's actually .net. So check all of this out. I'm very excited to have all these new contacts.
Well, we thank both of you
here.
for your time and for your presentations. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rima.
Bye.
Thanks, Arthur. Thank you
Bye.
all.
Next time.